Did you think that she had harbored any ill will toward her father because of that?
I don't know.
On the morning of the 14th of September 2007 in Onondaga County, New York, a teenage girl walked into her older sister's bedroom. Her sister was 20 years old. Her name was Ashley Wallace, and she was home from college. She was lying on the bed, and she was barely breathing. Somewhere in that house, there was also a single page of typed paper. It was a confession. It ran to about 750 words, and at the bottom of it, there was a signature, typed, not written. It said that Ashley Wallace had killed two men. One of them was her stepfather, David Castor, who had been found dead in that same house 2 years earlier. The other was her father, Michael Wallace, who had died in January of the year 2000, when Ashley was 12. Both men were dead. Both had died in ways that, at the time, nobody treated as murder. David Castor's death had been ruled a suicide. The file had closed. Michael Wallace was 38 when he died, and he was buried without an autopsy of any kind, because his wife declined to give permission for one. So on that morning, police officers were standing in a house looking at a piece of paper that appeared to solve two deaths nobody had been investigating. And the young woman who had supposedly written it was being carried out to an ambulance with, in the district attorney's later description, a cornucopia of drugs in her system. He was told afterwards that she had been about 15 minutes from death. Ashley Wallace survived. Within hours of becoming coherent again, she told an investigator two things. She had not tried to kill herself, and she had not written that note. Somebody had. The question that eventually took this case to a jury was never really whether the confession was true. It was who typed it, and when. There was something else about that morning, and it came from the woman who made the emergency call.
What happened?
The call was placed by Ashley's mother. She told the dispatcher that her daughter had taken alcohol and a number of doses of medication. She also told them about the note. Christine Garvey, who was then an assistant district attorney in Onondaga County, described what struck her about that recording. The caller seemed to want the dispatcher to know a suicide note existed. It appeared to matter more to her than her daughter's condition did. That denial Ashley gave in the hospital matters more than it might sound, and it's worth slowing down on, because a court later had to decide whether a jury was even allowed to hear it. Ordinarily, what a person says outside a courtroom can't simply be repeated inside one. There are exceptions. One of them covers a statement made so soon after an event that the person hasn't had time to think about how to shape it. That's the exception the trial judge applied here. The appellate court agreed and put its reasoning plainly. Ashley Wallace's denial came before there had been time to contrive and misrepresent. Sergeant Michael Norton was the one who told her. He said he explained that there was a note in which she confessed to killing her father and her stepfather. He described her reaction wide-eyed, and then a flat, immediate denial. Not the note, not the suicide attempt, not either death. And before she'd had any opportunity to work out what any of that meant for anybody, she'd already said it. To understand why that note existed at all, why it was typed in September of 2007 and not at any point in the 7 years before it, you have to go back to a locked bedroom door in August of 2005. David Castor ran a heating and air conditioning business in Central New York. In 2001, through her employer, he met a woman named Stacey Wallace. She'd been widowed the year before. They married on the 16th of August 2003, and she took his surname. By her own description, he was conscientious, work-driven, a man who was happiest outdoors. He had snowmobiles, he had four-wheelers, he had a boat. She said he'd been support and strength and security to her. He had a grown son from an earlier marriage, David Castor Jr., and a sister, Linda Horzempa. His ex-wife, Janice Poissant, was still in the picture. Stacey's own account of the household was that it hadn't been easy. She said her daughters weren't happy about the marriage, that they hadn't wanted their father replaced. She said David could be difficult with them, that he expected to be obeyed without argument, and that her children questioned everything. That was her account. It's worth holding on to, because within 2 years it was going to become the foundation of a very specific story about who in that house was capable of what. And there's one more thing about David Castor, which never appeared on any document connected to his death. He worked on cars. Constantly. It was the thing he did with his time, and everyone who knew him knew it. Hold on to that too. It turns out to be the single most important thing anybody said about him. On Monday, the 22nd of August, 2005, Stacey Castor called 911. Her account was that her husband hadn't turned up for work that morning. She said the last time she'd spoken to him was 5 o'clock on the Sunday, and that he had locked her out of their bedroom. She described the weekend to investigators afterwards. Sergeant Norton summarized what she told them. That David had become upset, that he'd taken a bottle of Southern Comfort into the bedroom, that he'd locked the door behind him and got drunk, and that he wouldn't come out. She told Detective Diane Lashinsky that she'd assumed he was sleeping it off. She told a friend, Danny Coleman, that she'd known he was sleeping, that she had put her ear against the door and heard him. She also offered investigators a reason. She said David had been depressed. He had recently lost his father, and in her account, the drinking that weekend and what she said followed it came out of that grief. When deputies arrived, they were asked to force the bedroom door. David Castor was inside. He was dead, and he had been for some time. One of the deputies who was there, a man named Willoughby, remembered her reaction outside that room. He said she was screaming that he wasn't dead. The room told a story, and for a while it was a story that held together. On the nightstand beside the bed, there were 2 glasses. One of them held a green liquid. Under the bed, pushed partway out of sight, there was a bottle of antifreeze with its cap off. There was no note. It read as a man who had gone into a room alone with a bottle and a glass and not come out again. Toxicology confirmed the substance. Ethylene glycol, the active ingredient in antifreeze. There was one more item, though it wasn't in the bedroom, and at that point nobody could say what it meant. In the kitchen, in the rubbish bin, there was a turkey baster. A deputy noticed droplets inside it. He pulled the rubber bulb off the end and smelled it, and what he could smell was alcohol. He knew there'd been drinking in the house. He knew there was antifreeze in the house. He bagged it anyway, and there was something faintly wrong with the antifreeze bottle, which meant nothing on its own and a great deal later. The carpet around it was soiled. The bottle itself was clean, which raises a question about when it arrived there. The medical examiner's finding was suicide, and that finding closed the case. Not for a few weeks, for 2 years, David Castor was buried. His estate went into probate, and his widow was the personal representative of it. As far as the official record of Onondaga County was concerned, a man had taken his own life in August of 2005, and there was nothing further to look into. This is a part of the story that the title of this film is about, and it's worth sitting with before we go any further. Everything you're about to hear was found by people who kept going after the case was already answered. Some of them were family. David Castor's ex-wife rejected the suicide finding outright. So did his sister, and her argument was the one that never appeared on any death certificate. He worked on cars. A man who spends his life around engines knows what antifreeze is, and he knows it isn't quick. Ethylene glycol poisoning can take as long as 72 hours to kill a person. Those are not gentle hours. It's a death you would have to commit to and keep committing to while it happened to you. Her argument was simple. Of every way her brother might have chosen to die, this was the one he was best equipped to know was the worst. That isn't evidence. It wouldn't have moved a medical examiner, and it didn't. But it was enough to stop one detective letting the file stay shut. Detective Dominic Spinelli of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department started sending things to the laboratory. The antifreeze bottle, a bottle of apricot brandy, the 2 glasses from the nightstand, the turkey baster from the kitchen bin. The glass that had held the antifreeze came back with 3 fingerprints on it. All 3 belonged to Stacey Castor. Not one of them belonged to David, and it was the position of them that Spinelli kept returning to. The print sat low near the base, as though the glass had been held from underneath. Now, Spinelli was careful about this, and it's worth being just as careful here. He said so himself. There was an innocent explanation available. She might have put the glass away from the dishwasher, holding it that way. People handle glassware without thinking about it every day. But there was a second possibility, and he named that too. A person holding a glass from the bottom is a person holding it up to somebody else's mouth. 1 glass, 2 readings. On its own, it settled nothing. Then the turkey baster came back. Inside it, ethylene glycol. the same substance that killed David Castor. And on the tip of it, David Castor's DNA. On the tip, not on the handle. Think about what that distribution means. A man who picks up a baster to use, it holds a handle. That's where his hands go. That's where his DNA would be. Here it was at the other end. The end that goes into someone. That is the moment the reading of that bedroom changed. Not a man alone with a bottle. A man who at some point in those hours was no longer able to drink for himself. The death was reclassified. What had been a suicide in August of 2005 became a homicide investigation. But a homicide investigation needs more than a mechanism. It needs a reason. David Castor left an estate valued at roughly $300,000. A will was produced for probate. It was dated 2003. It left everything to his wife and to her 2 daughters. It left nothing at all to his son. David Jr. contested it. Then he withdrew his objections, and he withdrew them for a specific reason. 2 witnesses had sworn formal affidavits confirming they had watched his father sign that document. Those witnesses were Lynn and Paul Pulaski, friends of Stacey Castor. Lynn Pulaski later described the friendship from the witness stand. She said she had considered Stacey her best friend, like a sister. Here is what the Pulaskis eventually admitted. They signed that will in 2005. The document they signed was dated 2003. They had put their names to a will as witnesses to a signing they never attended by a man who was already dead. Lynn Pulaski's account was that she'd been told the estate needed settling, that there were debts to be paid, and that this was simply how it got done. District Attorney William Fitzpatrick granted the couple immunity in exchange for their testimony against Stacey Castor. Years later, a civil court in Onondaga County examined the same conduct and was considerably less forgiving. Judge Anthony Paris found that the Pulaskis had not been innocent pawns, that they knew what they were doing was wrong, and that they only came forward once the district attorney's investigators arrived at their door. He awarded David Castor Jr. and his mother around $127,000 in compensatory damages and a further $250,000 in punitive damages. So by now, investigators had a mechanism, and they had a motive, and they had something else, a pattern of a woman managing what happened to a dead man's paperwork. 3 months after David Castor's death, Spinelli had picked up the phone to investigators in the next county along, because there was a question sitting in the file that nobody had ever asked. If the second husband's death wasn't what it appeared to be, what about the first? Stacey met Michael Wallace in 1984 when she was 17. They married at the start of the 90s, and they had 2 daughters, Ashley and then Bree. Years afterwards, describing him, she said he'd been larger than life. The life of any party, that if you needed something he had, he'd give it to you. She also told ABC News that he had struggled with drugs and alcohol for a long stretch of his life. They worked opposite ends of the clock. She was an ambulance dispatcher during the day. He was a mechanic in the evenings. In the winter of 1999, he got sick, and he went to a doctor about it. The note that came out of that visit suggested it might be an inner ear problem. A former friend of Stacey's has said that around this period, she was contemplating divorce. On the 11th of January 2000, Michael Wallace was found unresponsive on the sofa in the family home. He was pronounced dead at hospital. He was 38. The cause was recorded as a heart attack. His sister asked for an autopsy. She was told it wasn't necessary, that the doctors had it right. The decision belonged to his widow, and his widow declined it. Michael Benson, who wrote a book about this case, put the strangeness of that plainly. A healthy grown man lies down on a couch and dies. That is an obvious candidate for an autopsy. But the doctor said heart attack, and his wife said that was good enough. So Michael Wallace went into the ground at 38 with no examination of any kind. 3 facts sat in the file afterwards, and in 2000, not one of them meant anything. When investigators eventually pulled his medical records, years later, looking for the catalog of illness they'd been told about, Sergeant Norton said the worst thing they could find in his history was a hernia. Stacey Castor collected $55,000 on a policy on his life. And when David Castor died 5 years afterwards, she arranged for him to be buried directly beside her first husband. Getting permission to exhume Michael Wallace took close to a year. The delay was jurisdictional. He was buried in Cayuga County, not Onondaga, and that meant separate authority and separate paperwork at every stage. The exhumation itself was done quietly, and it was done that way on purpose. Investigators had put a camera on the Castor house. They had put a second camera on the graveyard where both husbands were buried. They had a wiretap on her phone. They did not want Stacey Castor to know. Ethylene glycol does something to a body that doesn't fade with time. It forms crystals in the organs, and those crystals stay. Michael Wallace came out of the ground on the 5th of September, 2007. Sergeant Norton remembered how the medical examiner put it to him afterwards. Wallace was loaded with crystals. Spinelli's reaction was the conclusion the whole investigation had been circling for 2 years. At that point, he knew he had a double homicide. There's a detail from the surveillance that belongs here because of what it tells you about how fast she moved. They learned from one of those intercepted calls that Stacey Castor had been to the cemetery, not months afterwards, soon after her first husband's body was taken out of it. Hold that date, the 5th of September. Everything that follows happens inside the next 9 days. 2 days later, on the 7th of September, Stacey Castor sat down with police to talk about her husband's death. She was read her rights, and she waived them. Spinelli was working through the physical evidence with her, and he asked her a straightforward question about the glasses on the nightstand. Which one, he asked, had she poured the cranberry juice into? She started to answer, and what began to come out of her mouth was not the word cranberry. She got as far as the first syllables of the word antifreeze. She pronounced it, as she always did, anti-free, and then she stopped herself mid-word and corrected it. She'd meant the cranberry juice. He had not told her what was in that glass. Spinelli picked up on it, and the moment he did, the temperature of the room changed. She accused him of trying to frame her, and she ended the interview. There was one other moment in that room. As Spinelli was putting a photograph back into his folder, she caught sight of another image inside it, and she stopped and asked him what it was. It was the turkey baster. She wanted to know why the police had a photograph of a turkey baster. By his account, he told her not to worry about it. She walked out of that building knowing precisely what they had kept. 5 days after the exhumation, on a Wednesday, Ashley Wallace was at college. It was her first day. 2 investigators came to find her there, and what they had come to tell her was that her father had not died of a heart attack. He had died of antifreeze poisoning. She was 20 years old, and she had just been told that her father was murdered. She did what most people would do. She called her mother. That call was intercepted. On the recording, her mother asked her questions, what the detectives said to her, what she said back, what exactly they know. And then her mother suggests that the 2 of them have a drink together. They both had a hard day. Fitzpatrick described what happened after that drink was made and handed to her. She became lethargic. She passed out. She ended up in her bedroom. She woke the next morning with what she took to be a hangover, and she went to school. That is the 12th of September. On the 13th, she came home, and her mother offered to do it again, a suggestion according to former Detective Valerie Brogan, framed as celebrating Ashley's 21st birthday a little early. Ashley drank a second cocktail her mother made for her. This one, she said, didn't taste right. Sergeant Norton described what her mother did about that. She fetched her daughter a straw. She told her to put the straw to the back of her throat and to drink it down. And Ashley did what her mother told her to do. Then she was tired and she went to lie down. She did not come out of that bedroom again until medical personnel carried her out of it the following morning. Here is what makes those 2 evenings something other than a mother and daughter having a drink after bad news. The note had already been written. It came off the hard drive of the family's own computer, and the dates were not in dispute. The first draft was created 4 days after Stacey Castor learned her first husband's body had been exhumed. There were further drafts on the 11th of September and on the 12th. Ashley Wallace was not in the house when they were written. So the sequence is this. On the 5th, they dug up Michael Wallace. Within 4 days, there was a document confessing to killing him. On the 12th, the first drink. On the 13th, the second drink and the straw. On the 14th, a girl 15 minutes from death, and a mother on the phone to a dispatcher making sure the note got mentioned. The confession was typed before the young woman who supposedly wrote it was ever handed anything to drink. The document came first. The act it was meant to explain came afterwards. And there's one more thing in that note. It's the reason this case ended the way it did, and it is the part that almost never gets told. The note didn't only confess to killing Michael Wallace. It said that he had also ingested rat poison. Now consider what was publicly known about Michael Wallace's death in September of 2007. He had died of a heart attack. That was the official finding, and it had stood untouched for 7 years. There had been no autopsy. His widow had refused one. No toxicology. No examination. No file. Nobody had ever established that anything at all had been administered to Michael Wallace. And the exhumation, which had only just happened, established antifreeze. It said nothing whatsoever about rat poison. So that detail was not a matter of public record. It was not a matter of any record. The appellate court set out what followed from that in a single line. It was a fact that could be known only by the person who killed him. Stacey Castor acknowledged that there had been rat poison in the home. She had written a confession designed to convict her daughter of 2 murders. And in the course of making it convincing, in the course of adding the kind of specific, private, unpublished detail that makes a confession read as true, she put in something no innocent person could have supplied, including the young woman it was written for. It was meant to be the final statement of a girl who was not expected to be alive to argue with it. Instead, the daughter woke up, and the note talked. Stacey Castor was arrested at the hospital on the 14th of September, 2007, and charged that day. She was indicted in December on 1 count each of second-degree murder, second-degree attempted murder, and a scheme to present a forged will. She described her own history with the law afterwards. A speeding ticket at 18. That was the whole of it. She said being arrested and handcuffed terrified her and that she couldn't believe it was happening. In September of 2008, the trial judge ruled that evidence about Michael Wallace's death could be put in front of a jury. That ruling was fought hard, and the argument against it was not a frivolous one. It was litigated all the way to the appellate division. Stacey Castor was not on trial for the death of Michael Wallace. She had never been charged with it. Her lawyer, Chuck Keller, argued that allowing a jury to hear about an uncharged killing she'd had no ordinary opportunity to defend herself against made a fair trial impossible. The court's reasoning ran the other way. The 2 deaths shared a method distinctive enough to point at one person. And the Wallace material could not be separated out from the note, because the note was largely about Michael Wallace. You cannot explain a document to a jury while withholding what the document says. The appellate division upheld that in 2012, unanimously. The trial opened on the 12th of January, 2009. The defense case was that Ashley had killed David Castor, and that Ashley had tried to take her own life. 2 days in, the prosecution called its first witness, and its first witness was Ashley Wallace. She was 22 years old. She took the stand and testified in tears about the deaths of her father and her stepfather, and about the drink her mother put straw into. Fitzpatrick later described what it was to watch that. A woman 50 feet from her own child, listening to that child say, "You tried to kill me." Stacey Castor testified in her own defense. Under cross-examination, she was confronted with the intercepted phone calls and with the computer evidence, the drafts, and the dates on them. The prosecution's case by then had DNA, it had computer forensics, and it had forensic linguistic analysis, all pointed at one question: who wrote the note? The jury was out for 4 days. On the 5th of February 2009, Stacey Castor was convicted of the second-degree murder of David Castor, the attempted second-degree murder of her daughter, and offering a false instrument for filing. Her own account of that moment was that she sat still, didn't look around, and waited for it to finish. Fitzpatrick, outside, said that if there was a ceiling in terms of evil, she was at it. David Castor Jr. said 2 words: justice was served. On the 5th of March, she was sentenced by Judge Joseph Fahey in Onondaga County Court. Before that happened, both of her daughters addressed the court. Ashley told a packed courtroom that she hated her mother for ruining so many people's lives, and that she didn't know why she'd done it. She ended by saying goodbye to her. Speaking to David Muir that year, she put the rest of it into words that are hard to improve on. She asked what had given her mother the right to play God with people. She said she hadn't known what hate was until then, and that she hated her and still loved her at the same time. She said her mother had been her best friend, and that she'd have done anything for her, and that her mother decided to kill her instead. Bree said it had felt good for her sister to be able to stand up and say it. The sentence was 51 1/3 years to life. Stacey Castor's position never moved an inch. She had not killed Michael Wallace. She had not killed David Castor. She had not tried to kill her daughter, and she would never say otherwise. Her mother, Judy Eaton, has never accepted the verdict. She has said she cannot believe her daughter had it in her to kill two men, and that Stacey would not have framed Ashley. The conviction was affirmed in October of 2012. The court identified a single error at trial and held it harmless. A later motion to vacate the judgment was denied, and that denial was affirmed in May of 2015. She was never charged over the death of Michael Wallace. She never will be. On the 11th of June 2016, Stacey Castor died at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She was 48. She never saw either of her daughters again. David Castor's estate did eventually reach his son. It took a criminal trial, a probate fight, and a civil judgment, and it arrived years after his father was buried. And Ashley Wallace, who was 12 when her father died on a sofa in January of 2000, and 20 when her mother handed her a drink in a straw, walked into a courtroom and told the jury the truth about the woman who raised her. There's a specific cruelty in what was done to her that's easy to move past, so it's worth naming clearly. She wasn't only supposed to die, she was supposed to die confessing to killing her own father, to killing her stepfather. She was meant to be remembered by her sister, by her grandmother, by everybody who had ever known the family, as the answer to two murders. That was the plan, and the plan required her not to be there to argue with it. It failed for one reason. The woman writing that confession needed it to be believed. So she reached for a detail that would make it real, something specific, something the police didn't have, something that had never been written down anywhere in 7 years. She could only reach for what she knew. She was writing in her daughter's name, but she could only write with her own hands. Ashley Wallace said afterwards that for some reason she was kept on this planet, and that she thought part of the reason was to bring justice to David and to her father and to herself. She woke up. The medical examiner ruled David Castor's death a suicide, and the file closed for 2 years. His sister pointed out that a man who worked on cars every day would have known exactly what antifreeze does to a person over 3 days. Knowing only what was on the table in August 2005, the locked room, the glass with 3 fingerprints, the bottle under the bed, the baster in the kitchen bin. Was suicide a reasonable ruling? Or should that file never have closed at all?